My name is Sean. I've photographed a couple hundred protests as a freelance photojournalist and documentary photographer. I've worked with small newspapers that you've never heard of, and entities like the New York Times, the Associated Press, the Washington Post, Getty Images, and others. In this video, I'm going to talk about what I've learned as a photojournalist documenting protests for more than 25 years. Before photographing a protest, we should do an assessment for the possible volatility of an event. We can do that by asking a few questions. What's the likelihood for counter-protesters and opposing groups? Is the protest against law enforcement, and are the police accused of murder? What role does race play? An overwhelming majority of protests are peaceful events without incident. Protests typically take one of two forms, a rally and/or a march. A rally will typically take place at a single location, and a march will move through the streets and on the sidewalks. Some protests will be organized by people who have secured permits, and some won't. Many of the latter are spontaneous events. Be aware of the situation that you're walking into. Some protests can last for hours and extend past midnight. Some marches can have police escorts to keep motorists and demonstrators separate. I find that marches are more interesting to photograph than rallies, and so I come prepared to march to rallies, even though most rallies don't turn into marches, because sometimes they do. Marches with permits will have a planned route and are more likely to have a police escort. The biggest dangers during marches and protests near roadways comes from motorists, and we have this in intentional acts like we saw in Charlottesville, with panicked motorists doing their best. Then we have bad and irresponsible drivers. Here in the United States, heading into the early part of 2025, we have a lot of partisan opposing groups and individuals who have an established history of confrontation in the streets. Keep this in mind. Before I dive deeper into protest photography as a photojournalist, it's important that we address the differences between documentary photography and photojournalism. Photojournalism is a type of documentary photography. Not all documentary photography is photojournalism. Photojournalism typically involves working on a deadline and publishing in a timely manner. Long-form projects exist, but they're rare. Trustworthy entities using photojournalism typically share similar ethical guardrails and also serve as resources for historians. These entities can be international newspapers and magazines, small independent websites and printed publications, or independent journalists using modern technology. One of the biggest distinguishers between photojournalism and other types of photography is the use of captions. Photojournalism uses captions to give us the who, what, where, when, and sometimes the why. This, among other things, allows an audience to do some fact-checking on what's going on in the image. And it's another reason why photo credits are important. Photojournalists study the guardrails and the processes specific to photojournalism, learning that we can't ask people to move, show us things, or perform for the camera in any way, unless we're making portraits and we identify that in our captions. Photojournalists are not paparazzi. We don't shout at the people we're photographing. Photojournalists often work alone in the field, but should have experience working around or with other journalists. Individual media organizations will set their own specific standards and guardrails for their use of photojournalism. And in 2025, that's pretty diverse. Photojournalists don't participate in the protests we cover. Documentary photographers have more leeway here. If you're not photographing a protest as a photojournalist, be honest about your execution and approach. I've photographed a good number of protests as a documentary photographer and not in the role of a photojournalist. Documentary photography is a lot like photojournalism, but without these parameters. Having more gear doesn't make anyone more capable of operating in any extreme scenario, because having more gear slows you down, and sometimes the best option is just to move fast. Whatever items you have in your kit, make sure you've got some experience using it. Do your goggles fog in different weather conditions? Can you use the camera viewfinder, or will you need to use the back display? And can you do this in direct sunlight if needed? Do you have a mask or a respirator? And if you have a respirator, do you have the appropriate filters? Do your goggles protect against impact, irritants, neither, or both? Are your shoes good for walking and running? Are you wearing long pants or shorts? Might you ever have to get on your knees for a low angle? Helmets offer different levels of protection against falls, projectiles, and some blunt force weapons. My local skateboard shop owner says that skateboard helmets are designed to protect against multiple impacts. As someone who's encountered tear gas on numerous occasions, I've found that a few bandanas can be extremely helpful because wiping your face with tear gas covered clothes is counterproductive. I have body armor that I can wear over my clothes and body armor that I can wear under for a more discreet appearance. I purchased this gear after receiving one too many threats from 2017-2020. I rarely ever use it, but I'm prepared. Bring water, but more importantly, stay hydrated in the days leading up to and the day of the event. I've tried out just about every method in an attempt to carry multiple cameras, but in the end, I've found that simplicity works the best. Currently, I'm just using two traditional Peak Design straps. They're nothing fancy, and if you adjust the straps to fit your particular size and shooting style, they work pretty well. I don't always carry a first aid kit with me to protest, but it's always in my vehicle, and when my pre-event assessment requires it, I bring that extra gear. I do not use traditional camera backpacks or shoulder bags, but instead put most of my accessories and extra lenses on my waist using a low pro belt system and their pouches. Think Tank also makes a good product. If I need to send files from the field and bring my laptop, I have an ultra slimline backpack that allows me to maneuver through tight crowds. Keep in mind, a lot of the things I'm talking about here, we're preparing for the extremes of any protests. There's been many a times when I've showed up to protests and there's been more photographers than demonstrators. But that said, protests are extremely unpredictable. I might suggest organizing your own specific bug-out photography bag. I typically wear photo identification from the National Press Photographers Association while also wearing other items that read press. The larger the police presence, the more obvious I try to make this. And I do this so that if I ever end up in court, law enforcement can't claim they didn't know what I was doing there. Unfortunately, in the United States, journalists have been labeled as enemies and are becoming targets. For this reason and for personal safety, you may want to be able to conceal press identifiers at times. I've learned that politicians don't need to use the powers of government to squash First Amendment rights if they have citizens willing to do the dirty work. The default protest photograph is a person standing, looking at the camera, holding a sign. There are 10 bazillion photos like this. Protests are about people and their motivations, grievances, fears, emotions, conflict, and so much more. The signs are just the easiest thing to photograph. A protest is so important that people stopped their normal daily routines, got off their couches to gather and raise hell somewhere. Photograph these emotions and tell these stories. The big challenge is having your camera trained on the right person with interesting framing at the right time. Pay attention. Things will repeat. If you see a sign that you find interesting, work on the composition as you wait for the person to do something interesting. If that person isn't doing anything interesting, try to put their sign in the foreground or the background of something else interesting. Using layers this way is a staple technique in storytelling. If you're interested in learning more about this, I've got a video here and linked in the description. As photojournalists, we have specific roles documenting protests, and they often don't align with organizers, law enforcement, counter-protesters, or politicians. When photographing rallies, I concentrate more on the crowd than I do any individual speaker. Rarely will any individual speaker command more attention than the crowd. To help show the scale of any crowd size, I use changes in elevations. I'm not afraid to climb things, and I pay attention to marches when there's rises and dips in the road. I bring step ladders and stools. In order to photograph a march from the front, I let the crowd wash over me, run back to the front, and then repeat. This requires physical fitness, but I run about 800 miles a year. If you're a photojournalist new to protest photography, I recommend introducing yourself to other journalists on the scene. It's important, working alone most of the time, that we can have some other people, that we can have some trust and understand what we're doing. If you don't feel comfortable out at a protest, look for another photojournalist that you can buddy up with. If you're a student photojournalist, don't be afraid to tell anyone. We were all here at one point, and in fact, we can all learn from each other still. On that note, feel free to share any tips about staying safe photographing protests in the comments. If you want to learn more about photojournalism, I've got a playlist linked in the description.